Hi, I'm Paul. Welcome back to another Blazor build. Today we build an accessible tooltip, or at least my interpretation of an accessible tooltip. Out of all the components that I have built and presented, this has undoubtedly been the most challenging in terms of what actually needs to be implemented. When creating these types of components, I generally browse the ARIA authoring practices guidelines for an example, but in this instance there isn't one due to ongoing discussions that started in 2016. The fact that 8 years later and there is still no example should sound alarm bells that this may not be as simple as a bit of text shown on a mouse over. I have literally spent days trying to research this topic to get a definitive answer in which to provide you, but sadly there appears to be no agreed consensus other than tooltips can be problematic. Much smarter people than myself who work in the accessibility space have written many posts on the subject of tooltips, which luckily for me have provided enough insight in which to build something that, although may not be perfect, I believe is a step in the right direction if a tooltip is necessary. The first hurdle to get over is what actually is a tooltip. For me this is quite simple, as I have seen and added them to applications since the mid-1990s. To me they are quite simply a bit of text that appears on mouse over, or when the item receives focus, that gives the user a bit more context about the item that back in the day was a toolbar button. Nothing more, nothing less. I believe the above statement still holds true today, albeit the tooltip may be attached to other items now, but anything more than that is something different in my eyes. It should be noted that tooltips are best avoided if you know that users are going to be on touch devices given the lack of mouse overs and focus by tabbing, as when the user touches the element that has a tooltip, the action that the tooltip was going to give context to has now likely taken place before the tooltip is displayed, if displayed at all. Given the issues surrounding tooltips, an adapted form of a tooltip called a toggle tip may be a better choice. These are similar to tooltips, but the user opts in to have them displayed via clicking or touching a dedicated button. I will likely build and present you one of these in the coming weeks, as most of the code used for this tooltip can be repurposed for a toggle tip. Before we get started, I should give a shout out to Sarah Higley, a Microsoft web developer who is active in the accessibility space, as I came across her YouTube video regarding tooltips during my research. Sarah's video and the research that she conducted helped me a lot, and I would recommend that you watch that video as well to get a better understanding of the accessibility issues surrounding tooltips. I have put a link to that video in the description as well. Let's begin, starting with the demo and then the code. On screen are 8 buttons, each with a button name indicating the position where the tooltip should be displayed. A few of the buttons have additional text that I will explain momentarily. If I move my mouse quickly over the left and bottom buttons, we do not see any tooltip or flicker, as in the CSS I added a slight delay before the tooltip is displayed. When I move my mouse over the top left button, the tooltip is displayed without the button receiving focus. If I press the escape key, the tooltip is dismissed. The use of the escape key for tooltips is a bone of contention, with some suggesting the control key. I leave this for you to decide which key should be used, as this is a configurable option in the code, not the component. Originally I had hoped to call this video Accessible Tooltip with or without JavaScript, but the Web Content Accessibility Guideline requirements regarding content on hover or focus put an end to that. Irrespective of the key used, it is a requirement that a tooltip can be dismissed by the user without moving the mouse pointer. Given that nothing has focus other than the document itself, then as far as I am aware, the only way to dismiss a tooltip in this instance is with an event listener added to the document. I will move the mouse back over the button to redisplay the tooltip. That little X icon acts as a non-focus receiving button that users with pointing devices can use to close the tooltip. Again, thanks to Sarah for that inclusion. I will now move the mouse to the other buttons so we can see the tooltip positions. I will not use the close button as the tooltips disappear when the cursor is not over the button, the tooltip trigger, or over the tooltip itself. I also added a slight delay of half a second before the tooltip disappears after you have left the button or the tooltip area. The top button with the ARIA label text will be discussed when I use the keyboard and screen reader to navigate. The right button, as indicated, does not have a close button in the tooltip. This is on by default, but is set via a component parameter. As I had to use JavaScript, well, TypeScript that outputs the JavaScript, I added some basic repositioning logic using the CSS modifier classes that were created for each of the 8 positions. I'll make the screen smaller and check the position of the bottom right tooltip before doing some resizing so we can see the position changes. Currently the tooltip fits in its intended location. If I make the screen height smaller, there will not be enough room for the tooltip, so it will now appear to the left. This repositioning logic goes clockwise using the modifier classes as indicated by the button names and the location. If I make the screen slightly smaller, there is now not enough height for the tooltip to go to the left again. So the code now checks top left, then top, but both of these would have the right edge off screen, so the position of top right is used. I will move the mouse over the buttons again so you can see any tooltips that have had to be repositioned. It's now time to turn on the freely available screen reader NVDA so we can listen to what it sees.
Speech mode beeps. Speech mode talk.
I will first click on the button using the mouse and then just use the tab key to navigate. As I did not alter any of the tab indexes, the tab navigation will go left to right per row instead of the clockwise order just demonstrated using the mouse.
Top left button tooltip for the top left button.
All of the buttons, excluding the top button, use the ARIA describe by attribute. I have not given these buttons an ARIA label, so the screen reader will announce the button's content text followed by button and then the tooltip text. It announces the tooltip text due to the link established between the button and tooltip text via the ARIA describe by attribute.
Top tooltip button.
The top button uses the ARIA labeled by attribute, so instead of its content being read followed by button and then the tooltip text, the screen reader only announces top tooltip followed by button. There are many instances where the ARIA labeled by attribute may be more appropriate than the ARIA described by attribute, and as such the component has a parameter that allows you to specify which attribute should be used.
Top right button tooltip for the top right button. Left button tooltip for the left button. Right, no close, button tooltip for the right button. Bottom left button tooltip for the bottom left button. Bottom button tooltip for the bottom button. Bottom right button tooltip for the top bottom right button.
Hopefully, listening to the text being read out, you will appreciate that the more succinct you can make any text, the happier a screen reader user will be. I only use a screen reader periodically, but after a few minutes the amount of stuff that's being announced just drives me crazy. Now the demo is complete, let's look at the project and go through the code in some detail so you can comfortably build your own tooltip component from scratch. But as always, the code is available to download from GitHub that you can freely use. The link is in the video description below. We will look at the component markup first, then the other files, ending with the C# code. As you can see, all we have is a simple div that will be set as an inline block that wraps the item that requires a tooltip. This item, aka the tooltip trigger, will be contained within the child content render fragment. We then have some nested spans to hold our tooltip text and an optional span that acts as a button and its child span for the SVG close icon that we saw in the demo. The containing div uses the Blazor @ref directive in order for us to be able to get a reference to this element, which will then be passed directly to JavaScript instead of just passing an ID and then doing a lookup to try and find it. As I use the B.E.M CSS naming convention, the global values.tooltip_class just returns our tooltip class name, which forms the block part of B.E.M. For those interested in this naming convention, I made a very short video regarding B.E.M. The link is also in the description below. The data-static attribute is something that I add to my components for dark and light themes, with the getStyleAsValue method returning a string dependent on the enum type parameter value. I will not be covering theming in this video, but if you'd like insights into the approach that I take, which is based on the use of CSS variables, then please watch one of my other videos regarding creating your own CSS framework for more information. The if block checks that the tooltip text is not null, white space or empty, that it's not disabled, and that the child content is also not null. If any of these are true, then there is no need to output the spans. With regards to accessibility, we assign the span the area role of tooltip and ensure that the ID attribute has a value, as we will use this ID to link the tooltip text to the tooltip trigger based on the parameter area type, and this is dependent on whether or not the user has manually added this association. I took the approach of not making this association automatic so users can control this process. I often just manually add these so I can see it clearly within the markup. After the text parameter, we then check if we should display the close button, the show close parameter being true by default. As this method of close is not for screen readers, we add the area hidden attribute. Its intention is just for the users to click or press without needing to use a key to dismiss the tooltip. Now you have seen the markup, let's look at the server project's homepage where I added the buttons and tooltips. The tooltip component, as mentioned, simply wraps the item requiring the tooltip and provides the appropriate parameter values. I manually added the area described by attribute to the first button, assigning my own ID to the component's control ID property. Also, as seen in the demo, for the top button I set the component parameter area type to labeled by, and for the right button I set the show close parameter to false. The other buttons are just using the parameter defaults. Let's turn our attention to the CSS. I have my usual root partial Sassy CSS file, which primarily is for the global level variables that control the tooltip background color and text color. The SVG icons partial file in this instance is just for the close icon. The main CSS file is used to control which partials are to be included in the output to CSS. Next, the tooltip partial file. I added the dash to avoid clashes with popular CSS frameworks that you might use in case you do not use your own. It's quite repetitive, but once you understand one of the modifier classes which make up the bulk of the code, you'll be fine. We start with our tooltip block element. The __ notation used for the variables just follows the growing trend of distinguishing variables that are private in scope as opposed to those globally scoped within the root. The position is set to relative to change it from the default of static, so we can absolutely position our tooltip text in relation to our div. The control inverse body area BG variable is part of my theme naming convention. If you use common globally scoped variables for your components, then a change to a variable can change all the components that use that variable. The name of this variable may seem a bit weird. but for light mode you may have black text on a white background, which may change to white text on a dark background for dark mode. This variable is the inverse. In my apps, it will use the dark mode colours when the application is set to use light mode and vice versa. The reason for the inline block is that our component will be wrapping inline elements, so this allows us to do that without altering how they would be positioned. We assign no widths or heights, so effectively whatever dimension the wrapped element has is what we have for our tooltip element. This allows us to position our tooltip using CSS without knowing anything about the wrapped content. If you are new to Sassy CSS, the ampersand just appends the parent selector to the text that follows it. On line 8, we are creating two selectors, which effectively say when the focus is somewhere inside our tooltip div or the mouse is over this area, then make our text visible, setting its opacity to 1 for transitions. We also set a small transition delay to delay the start of any transitions. This is what allows us to move the mouse quickly over the element without instantly seeing the tooltip. The selectors on line 14 hide the text, adding a larger delay before any transitions are started. This just gives the user a chance to move the pointer back over the area before it disappears, in case it was moved away in error. On line 20 is where we create our tooltip icon button class, setting the radius to 50% to make a circular target and setting the cursor to pointer to make it more obvious that this does something. The hover pseudo element is used to invert the background and text color to show the circular click target. Our tooltip text element is hidden by default and uses min width, max width and width to ensure a consistent look to the tooltips. The tooltip text width will not get smaller than 150 pixels but can grow to 250 pixels, after which it will break onto a new line. We assign the tooltip text class a z-index of 1, so our text goes above the tooltip siblings elements. You can give this a higher number, but without knowing the z-index of other components, the stacking context that they are a part of, and the order of which these stacking contexts are in, then it really is just a guessing game. You could use 1000, but if you're in the wrong stacking context, it will make no difference. If you have a scheme for your z-index, then give the z-index a value that fits your scheme. The only other thing to note about the text element is the transition settings used to show the text. Next is the ampersand double dash top. This will be created as tool-tip _text -- top. The double dash is the notation for a modifying class in B.E.M. We want the bottom of the tooltip to appear above the wrapped element, so we absolutely position the bottom to be 100% from its location, plus 20 pixels, which is twice our tip border width variable. Tip being the triangle created using the borders in the pseudo after element. This 20 pixels allows us to put half of the circular button, 12 pixels, into this space, and 5 pixels of the triangle formed from the top border. The top border is 10 pixels, but we shift it by 5 pixels, so the top two corners of the triangle are hidden by the circular button. One thing that may appear strange is the use of left 50% followed by a translate x of negative 50%. A left of 50% sets the left edge of the tooltip text to the middle of the tooltip trigger. Once at this location, a translate x of negative 50% moves it more to the left by half the size of the text span's width, thus aligning the centers. We target the close icon button within the modifier, negating the need to add modifiers to both the text span and the span used to create the close icon button. After all of this movement is complete, our top position tooltip will be horizontally centered above the tooltip trigger with a small gap between the tip of the tooltip and the tooltip trigger. All of the other position modifying classes just follow the same pattern. All the way at the end, we add a modifier to our block element, the tooltip class, which says if the tooltip also has the modifier class tooltip hide, then hide the text. We need to do this so it's more specific than the focus within and hover elements that alter the text visibility, as we need to hide the text with the escape key while it's still focused and visible. Now let's review the TypeScript code. The first line just declares an interface, so we have a typed object to work with when we pass configuration information contained within an anonymous object passed from our Blazor component. Next is the search criteria that we will use in a query selector. As we are creating a JavaScript module which acts like a singleton, we need a private flag that lets us know if we have registered a document key handler for dismissing the tooltips. On line 15, we declare a weak map to store event handler references for our tooltip mouse hover, the tooltip trigger focus event, and a key down handler to dismiss the tooltip when the trigger has the focus. Line 16 declares a separate weak map for the close button, which may or may not be present dependent on component parameters. I separated these as the first map was getting confusing. In hindsight, I think I should have used 3 maps, which would have made things less confusing. We also create a set to store the tooltips that are open, although we will always try to ensure that only one is open at a time. As we have a collection, we can just operate on it for any tooltips that it contains. The add hide tooltip class is just a simple arrow function that we can call to have the modifier class added to our tooltip that hides it. Next is the main routine that is called when the tooltip trigger receives focus or the mouse pointer is over it. The first line within the check initial tooltip position function just gets the name of the tooltip text class and appends a dot to the beginning for use within the query selector. After we have the class name, we can search our tooltip element that was passed in from Blazor for the span element that holds our tooltip text. If there isn't one, due to the tooltip being disabled, we just exit as there is nothing to do. As we only want one tooltip visible at a time, we can just blindly for each our set and add the hide class modifier to any item within it. After any item has had the hide class added, we can clear the set. Just to be safe, we ensure the tooltip that we are currently working with does not have the hide class modifier on it. Remove does nothing if there is nothing to remove. We then add our tooltip to the set. As we do not know if this is the first or 10th time that this tooltip has received the focus, we need to get the current modifier class so we can compare it against what was set at design time. If there isn't one, we just exit as there is nothing we can do. We then get the name of the modifier class set at design time and the current bounds of the tooltip div and the tooltip text span elements. Next we check if we have the initial modifier class that was assigned, and if so, if we can still use that position. If we do not have the design time class, or it does not fit the intended position, then we proceed to call the check and move tooltip position function. The first thing we do within this method is check whether the current tooltip position is still okay. If not, we then check the other positions in the order that these were added to the configuration string array, starting with the next modifier. We keep checking the classes in order until we find one. If not, we just keep the one we have and exit. The modifier within bounds method does what it suggests. It just checks to see if the modifier class was applied, would the text span fit in its intended position, returning a true or false value. Rather than add the class and then get a new set of bounds, I used the height and width of the existing one and then calculated where it would fit. This negates adding and removing classes unnecessarily. The checkSetArea attribute function checks to see if the user added the attribute type as was specified by the area type component parameter, and if it is not present, the attribute is added to the tooltip trigger. Next is the handle keydown event, which is used by both the document event handler and handlers added to each of the individual tooltip triggers. If the trigger has the focus, we first check if the user pressed the tab key to navigate away, and if so, just add the hide modifier class. If the user pressed the configured close key, we then just add a hide modifier class to any tooltips in the set. We then check if the trigger has the focus, as if that is the case, we can use stop propagation to stop the event bubbling up, negating issues with the escape key if that was the configured key. Earlier I mentioned some concerns over using the escape key. This is twofold. Some experts complain that many desktop applications use the control key and web applications should be no different, whilst others point out that the escape key also closes dialogues, and as such the user may try to dismiss a tooltip within a dialog but unintentionally close the dialog. You will have to use your own judgment on when and where to use tooltips and/or the likelihood of the described issue occurring. After this method, we have some arrow functions used to create the event handlers. The create keydown handler function is slightly different to the first three in that it returns a function in order to capture the keyboard event, which is then used to return the handler. The next four configure functions are all called from within the register tooltip function discussed shortly. The configure tooltip trigger method finds the first focusable element within the tooltip div, i.e. it searches the markup that was provided within the render fragment. If it finds a focusable element, such as a button, it then adds two event handlers, one for when the trigger receives the focus, the other for handling the keydown event to dismiss the tooltip with the configured close key. After this it calls the checkSet attribute as discussed, passing it the found trigger element. The configure tooltip function just adds an event listener to handle the mouse enter event. The configure global close handler adds an event listener to the document object, and as mentioned, given that JavaScript modules act like singletons, once the module has been loaded, it will remain in effect for the life of the application instance, so we only want to add this event once for all tooltips. The configure tooltip close button just adds a click event handler to our span, so it acts like a button to close the tooltip by adding the hide modifying class when clicked. The register tooltip function is called from our Blazor component and just calls the configure functions previously mentioned. The unregistered tooltip function is also called from our Blazor component, but when it is being disposed, so we can perform any cleanup operations. And finally, we just expose only the register and unregister functions for public use via the export statement. Now all of that is out of the way, we can look at the project structure and the C# code used. Looking within the Solution Explorer, we can see the usual two project setup that I use in my videos, an interactive Blazor server project using the location of global and a separate Razor class library called blazorbuilds.components for the tooltip component. All configurations used are also the same as my other videos. If you have not set up TypeScript or Sassy CSS in a project before, I made two very short videos on the configurations that I use. I have put links to these in the video description. Within the blazorbuilds.components project, I have my usual common folder with a subfolder called seeds. The global values file just contains values used within the project along with a couple of static helper methods. The only thing to note in this file is the getTooltips modifiers method, as this method returns a string array of modifiers consumed by the positioning logic. The order that they appear in here is the order that will be used by that positioning logic. The enums file just holds 3 enums. StyleAs is something that I now add to all of my components for theming purposes. The tooltip position enum just signals the position that the tooltip should have, with the area type enum for selecting whether to use the area described by attribute or the area labeled by attribute. Finally, we get to the tooltip folder containing our component. We have already seen the markup, and given there isn't a lot of markup or code, I did not bother to split the file into markup and code behind. When I first started using Blazor, I would always add a code behind as well as a view model. These days, for smaller components, I prefer just to stick with a single razor page approach. On line 26 is the parameter for the tooltip text, and it is marked with the editor required attribute to warn the user if this parameter value is not supplied. We then have a render fragment which will contain the tooltip trigger, such as an icon button. The next 3 parameters are the enums to capture the component options as just discussed. We have a string parameter, control ID, for the ID attribute of the span that is used by the area attribute. The user can supply an ID, but the markup checks and adds a GUID if it's missing. The disable parameter indicates whether or not the tooltip is disabled. If it is, the markup holding the tooltip text is excluded. This effectively excludes the tooltip text from being read by either users or assistive technology software. The last parameter, showClose, allows you to remove the clickable close button, with the default being to show this button. We then have a private property to hold the element reference of the tooltip div that will be populated by the @ref directive that we added to the markup. We can then pass this reference directly to the TypeScript code. Next is a private field of type IJS object reference that we will use to hold a reference to our JavaScript module. For this component, I did not see a need to use the onParameterSet lifecycle method to check or shadow the parameter values supplied, so the only lifecycle method used is the onAfterRenderAsync. In Blazor WebAssembly, we could use JavaScript earlier in the lifecycle as the DOM has already been loaded. For Blazor Server, we need to wait until the onAfterRender event before calling JavaScript. In the register tooltip method, we just create an anonymous object that matches the TypeScript interface that we created. But why did I not create a typed class? Quite simply because of the different naming conventions. I could have created a C# record class, which most people would expect to use Pascal casing for the property names, but TypeScript naming prefers camel casing for property names, so the anonymous type bridged the gap. Plus, I did not need this object for anything else. As a side note, Blazor will happily JSON serialize a typed object to TypeScript using the casing as is, or specified using the JSON property name attributes to change the casing. If you need more control over the serialization process, which uses the system.text.json serializer, just use the JSON serializer directly with your preferred options and provide the JS runtime with the JSON string instead of the object parameter type. The checkReduceBorderWidth method, which is called from our markup, just sets the border width CSS variable used in the modifier class calculations to half of what it is. This just reduces the gap between the tooltip text and the tooltip trigger if the close button is omitted. This method is notable if you have not seen this before, in that the markup is using inline style to change the value of a CSS variable used within the modifier class. The getPosition class simply returns the position modifying class based on the numeration value supplied. Last, we have the dispose method, where we call our TypeScript unregister method to remove any event handlers assigned. And with that, we are done. My last words on the subject of tooltips will be to use them sparingly, and although I do use them in my projects, especially for icon buttons, where possible I try to use static text instead. All of the links to external content mentioned within the video have been added to the video description below. Thanks for watching, and until next time, bye for now.